Hi there, you're listening to a podcast that's created and sponsored by Second Avenue Baptist Church. If you enjoy what you hear today, check out our website and app by visiting secondavenuembc.org. You can find our mobile app and tons more content, podcasts, sermons, and more by searching for Second Avenue on the Apple App Store or Google Play Store. With that being said, let's dive into today's episode.
Welcome to episode 79 of Decision Point. Today we ask the question, where do members learn doctrine? So glad you could join me once again for another episode. And we're asking the question today about understanding biblical doctrine. And really not just for members, for anyone. Before we get into that discussion, here's today's trivia. Before printed books became common, what were the major ways ordinary Christians learned church doctrine? Stick around to the end of the podcast for that answer. So, how do we learn doctrine today? Well, most churches have a doctrinal statement or about or a beliefs section on a website. They could be printed out somewhere in the church building. They used to put them on the doors, on the walls of churches when I was younger. But the doctrinal statements normally don't enter a church member's mind through that statement alone, their understanding of biblical principles. Most members learn doctrinal statements or doctrine of the church through the sermons, Sunday school, and repeated church practice. There could be Bible studies involved as well. Acts 2:42 actually talks about that very specifically, saying that the new Christians, the first church, they continued steadfastly or devoted themselves into the apostles' doctrine or teaching, and the fellowship and breaking of bread, and in prayers. So they would learn this new Christianity, this new religion. It's not really a religion, but they would learn the doctrinal truths about who Christ was and what he did, how he fulfilled the Old Testament through a typical church service. But in those days, that's really all they had was that church. And so when the apostles would teach, they would learn directly from those who learned directly from Jesus. A little easier than today because we have so many things in our ears, so many ideas and concepts that come up that can really cause disunity and confusion. Doctrine is something that is learned rather than just taught. So you hear these things, and especially in today's society, we're such a fast-paced society. We want it quickly, we want it now. And so we hear all these things consistently over and over again, and we get it confused sometimes with things we've learned or just good old-fashioned sayings that your grandma told you when you were growing up. But doctrine should also not just be taught at church. It should be taught in everyday conversation and your examples. In the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 6:6-7 says this, "And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up." See, biblical doctrine is not just for the church pew. It's not just for gathering together. Titus 2:1 also tells us, "But as for you, speak the things which are proper for sound doctrine." Now, we're talking about Titus here, but I think everyone, that is a very important conversational piece. Let's speak things which are proper. Let's not be confusing. Let's not teach one thing and say another. Let's be very, very specific in what we say and intentional in how we say it. See, God's truth is to be taught diligently in everyday life through your conversation, through your examples. As a matter of fact, that word conversation in the King James Version, when you read that, it's really telling us of all of our discipline, all of our life, and our actions in everything. Teaching was not and should not be limited to formal lectures. If you're raising your children, nieces, nephews, even talking to your friends, they should not get all of their understanding of who God is simply when they go to church. Because the truth is, unlike the first church in Acts, we don't gather, but most of the time once a week, if they gather once a week. Your church can have multiple services. We understand that, and there are few in every church who attend the majority of services. But at best case, you're going to get some families there at church one time a week. That's not enough to fully understand doctrine, to fully understand what the Bible teaches. It should happen in the rhythms of family and community. And for us parents out there who are dedicated to the church, not to the church itself, but to Christ, who established the church, and we're dedicated to the church in which we serve or are a part of, remember, we bring our children there. If you go to the old traditional 3 times a week, if your church has a Sunday morning, a Sunday night, and a Wednesday evening service, at best, you're getting possibly 3 hours of teaching at best. How many hours a day do they look at social media and listen to songs that don't honor God? So we need to make sure we're intentional with doctrine. Now, speaking of songs, doctrine should also be taught in the songs that we sing. Colossians 3:16 says, "Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord." It's important, it's very vital that the songs we sing in church and even on Christian radio, that they're theologically and biblically accurate. And it takes discernment. It takes wisdom in knowing what to listen to and what not to listen to understand where these songs are trying to purvey or trying to tell us what's going on in the songs, and do they really line up with Scripture, or are they more me-centric about how I feel and my emotions? It's no wonder why we get so confused in our doctrinal understanding when you ask somebody what they think about Jesus, how they're saved, what does baptism represent, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm going to throw a term out there that's going to worry some people, but catechisms. Now, we associate those now with the Catholic Church, but the term catechism in itself is simply the English translation of a Greek word that means oral instruction. Oftentimes, they're brief summarizations of beliefs that a church or group holds necessary, and in many cases, they're a question and answer format that's designed to be easily memorized by students. Matter of fact, the earliest known Christian catechism was the Didache. It was around 60 to 85 AD. It's an anonymous source, but it led learners through fundamental pillars like the 10 Commandments, baptism, Lord's Supper, the Lord's Prayer, and a lot more. But it made theological concepts easier to understand and recall. Very similarly like we do in songs, like children's church songs, Sunday school songs, songs that help us memorize the fruits of the Spirit, songs that help us memorize the order of the books of the Bible, things like that. Very important that we not misuse the word catechism as something that's necessary and appropriate through the foundation of the church and how we learn the church's doctrine, but how we learn the gospel, how we learn doctrine in our real life, everyday life. And we use that more than we know, we just don't call it catechisms. Well, 2 Timothy 2:2 tells us this. "And the things you have heard from me among many witnesses, commit these to faithful men who will be able to teach others also." Not to accuse any church or any person of falling short, but this is one of the greatest areas we fall short. Of course, also in our conversation day to day and our actions day to day. But oftentimes, we get people who want to teach, they want to speak or preach, but they don't really want to mentor, or they don't really want to pass down the information in a way of taking their time to disciple a younger person. But Paul's telling Timothy here that we need to pass down the truth intentionally to other people, train them in the way, because doctrine is not meant to be stuck with one person. It's meant to move from teacher to learner, and then from the learner to others. And those learners one day become teachers. And it's a cycle that continues down when we learn correct biblical doctrine. And this is why clarity matters. If the pastor explains any doctrinal concept in one way, take your pick a doctrine. But you have a teacher in a class, or conversations that are happening with members of a church, or there's an assumption into what the pastor meant to say. Maybe he didn't really say it that way, but members can become confused. And we see that probably in every church across America, that there's not a true unity in the doctrine. There's not a true submission to what the local church is teaching. And we teach our opinions. We get things mixed up sometimes. We don't understand fully together as a unity, as a body of Christ, as teachers get together and explain these things to one another and make sure that we're on the same page, because then confusion sets in. But if we teach intentionally, if we make sure, if there's a curriculum per se, that we're covering doctrines very specifically according to a certain order, will there be questions raised? Absolutely. Discussions will still be had, but we're not going to be teaching accidentally and hoping that it lines up, or saying, hey, this is how I understand it. I think a stronger way to do that is, this is how we as our church here understand this specific doctrine. This is what's taught at this church according to our understanding of the Bible. Now, people will still form their beliefs from hints and habits and assumptions. But the question is not whether members will learn doctrine, but whether they'll learn it clearly and biblically. So when the church teaches intentionally, members are better prepared to understand biblical doctrines. Then they can explain them to others and practice them in unity. So in closing here, the application is for every one of us in a teaching ministry to ask, are we reinforcing the same biblical truths as our pastor, as the teacher next door, as those who are teaching our youth, those who are leading our men, those who are leading our women and children? One cannot assume that a church or a pastor's stance on every doctrine is true without having done your own study. Okay, so I want to make that very clear. And hopefully you're at a church that they believe what you believe. And if not, those are conversations to be had. However, I think there's a greater danger when we knowingly or unknowingly teach any biblical doctrine differently than those who have spiritual authority over us, meaning the pastor. That only brings confusion and disunity. So have those conversations when they're necessary. But we need to make sure that we're teaching doctrinal unity, and that is strengthened through repeated, patient, and plain teaching. Well, before we end today, of course, we got to get back to today's trivia answer. The question was, before printed books became common, what were the major ways that ordinary Christians learned doctrine? Well, that was through catechisms, sermons, creeds, songs, and repeated oral instruction. Maybe we should have an intentional focus back on those things once again. As always, thank you for listening to today's message. Go out and change someone's life today, and join me again next time for another Decision Point.
Thank you for listening today, and if you enjoyed what you heard, consider leaving us a 5-star rating and review. It will help us reach more people just like you who need to hear this message. Also remember that you can stay connected with us by downloading our mobile app. Just search for Second Avenue spelled out on the App Store or Google Play Store. Thank you again for listening, and God bless.